Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us in 2023 to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. If you are a licensed mental health practitioner, you can join the Level 2 NARM Therapist training. This Level 2 training is a clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. And now for our interview. Dr. Diane Poole Heller is an established expert in the field of trauma resolution with 30 years of experience in spiritual exploration. Dr. Heller began her work with Peter Levine, founder of Somatic Experiencing, in 1989 and has served on the SE Trauma Institute teaching team since 1992. Diane has created a highly successful series of media resources, and as a dynamic speaker and teacher, Diane has been featured at international seminars and conferences. Diane is co-author of the book Crash Course, as well as numerous articles in the field. Diane is also the president of Trauma Solutions, a psychotherapy training organization. Dr. Laurence Heller is the founder of the neuroaffective relational model, a specialized psychobiological approach to working with developmental trauma. He holds a PhD in psychology and was in private practice for over 30 years. Dr. Laurence Heller has written or co-written the books Crash Course, Healing Developmental Trauma, and The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma. He is currently working on a project to bring a trauma-informed understanding to pediatricians and general practitioners throughout the United States. Please enjoy this conversation between Dr. Diane Poole Heller and Dr. Laurence Heller.
Hi, Dan. Well, welcome to our podcast here, Transforming Trauma.
It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to it. It's always fun having a conversation with you.
Yeah, probably a lot of our listeners don't know that you and I have known each other for, 40 years now or something like that? I
guess so. I haven't counted, but it's been a really long time.
It's been a long time. And the interesting thing, too, given the theme today is about trauma and spirituality, is that we actually met in a spiritual context doing spiritual work. And that's just a love that both of us have shared and does inform our work. And that's going to be one of my first questions to you.
Yes, I think having a deep spiritual commitment actually is really hugely relevant, kind of a marriage made in heaven for if you're doing therapy or healing work. It just gives you a broader context and a holding for you as well as the client that maybe always isn't addressed specifically when you're talking to them, but it's there in the field.
Yeah, I've experienced that exact same thing. It is there in the field. And, I'm just curious in terms of any other elements about that you see in terms of how this has influenced your work. And feel free to talk a little bit about your work. I know you're very well known and a lot of people know your work, but probably maybe not all of our listeners know exactly what it is that you do. So you might just give a brief intro to, the various things that I know you always have several balls in the air at a time like myself.
Yes,
but just anything you want to share about your work that help people get to know you.
Well, you and I also were teachers for Peter Levine for several years, and the Somatic Experiencing trauma work. And gosh, I probably was involved with that teaching internationally for 35 years. And then I'm still co-teaching or co-hosting courses with Peter now. So that somatic piece that added to all the other psychological and physiological things that happen with trauma, I think is really helpful to have that somatic understanding as well. Regulating the nervous system, working with Stephen Porges's work on social engagement, like really looking at how to untangle the threat response from our ability to move back into our prefrontal cortex, where we're back in connection with the relationship, because trauma removes us from connection so deeply. And that's what really led me into the work I'm focusing primarily on now, really working physiologically, working with all the normal things that people work with trauma. We can talk about that if we want to. But really understanding that one of the biggest problems is that we lose connection. We lose connection to ourselves. We lose connection to the ground. We lose connection to higher source, whatever you want to call that. God, Allah, just something bigger than our human experience. And we especially lose connection with people that we're close to, our partners, our friends, people that are important in our life. So I got really maniacally focused on how to work with reconnecting after trauma, or just in general. And that led me to deeply diving into attachment work and understanding how attachment happens from the get-go, even in utero, all the way into our infancy years, and then what kinds of injuries can happen in an attachment situation, so that we can look at clinically how to really mend that, even underneath whatever particular traumas people are dealing with, that will really affect the efficacy of their healing.
Yeah. And, again, just to kind of pass this by you, and my orientation is quite similar to what you're talking about, and I couldn't help but thinking about the original title of the Healing Developmental Trauma book. The original title was Connection, Our Deepest Desire and Greatest Fear. And here you are talking about connection. It's not surprising, because we often see things somewhat similarly. And I agree that the symptoms that we experience in trauma are all functions of some kind of disconnection. And then actually, instead of extinguishing symptoms in NARM, we focus on where the areas of disconnect that they're pointing to, and using those symptoms as a guide. So, again, common ground. The other thing I find too is that in my work, there's a lot of focus on identity, how in our adaptation to trauma, our identity gets distorted. And one of the things that I think has helped me is coming from a non-Western, spiritual is a challenging word. It has positive associations for some people, negative for others. But coming from this non-Western or spiritual perspective, it provides a kind of a depth to look at the identity distortions that we all have dealt with in different ways, and provides kind of a deeper place for all of us, both the therapist and the client, to come from in addressing some of these significant distortions like self-hatred and self-judgment and shame, all these elements. Exactly. Yeah.
It's helpful, I think, as a clinician to have a spiritual path, whatever it might be. I think it's helpful for humanity, actually, for humans to have orientation that way. But things get so vast when you sort of see the sort of interconnection of everything. Like you think about things being the ocean, and then these identities are sort of the flotsam and jetsam, floating on top of the surface of the ocean. But the ocean is underneath it all. And in a way, everything's the same. It's not so differentiated. But knowing that that's holding everything, and these identifications come up, these wounds come up, they get solidified, we tend to constrict, we get rigid, or we get really emotionally flooded around certain areas and certain wounds. And we do the same thing, I think, in the DARE work. It stands for Dynamic Attachment Repatterning Experience, highly experiential, very somatically and relationally based. And we're really working with what we understand about attachment healing and also attachment injury to help these issues move through around connection, around how we see ourselves, how we relate to ourselves, what we project onto the world. This original relational template happens so young, and we may just be sort of wired if we grew up in a chaotic or overly traumatizing history, an abusive history that so many of our clients have, and so many humans have, so many of us have, that it really influences how we feel about ourselves and how we experience the world. And I think it helps so much to understand that there is something larger. There is something that has a quality of basic goodness or harmony. I believe the universe is friendly. They remember when they asked Einstein if he could ask any question, what would the question be? What would be the most important question? And he said, is the universe friendly? I'm biased in that direction. I believe it is. And I think it supports me to do the work I do. And I think it also, when we have that underlying sense of things, we can tap into that larger understanding, that larger wisdom, really helps us guide ourselves and our clients into a better space.
I do share that kind of optimistic perspective. And sometimes I know for many people it's challenging, given the horrible things that we as human beings do to each other and to ourselves, to ultimately have this experience, really more than just a certain kind of experiential embodied knowing that the universe is a friendly place. And again, in my work, I think part of what informs it is that the connection that we experience is only on a level of awareness. None of us can really be disconnected in the sense that, we're always connected to the source. We just lose the awareness of that, particularly when we've had to adapt to an early attachment loss or difficulties or different kinds of traumas, that we lose from a very early age the awareness of this deep, supportive underlying connection that is always there. And so that again gives us a solid base to help people return to, because it's just, again, as I mentioned, it's just on a level of awareness that we lose that understanding.
Right. That's what trauma really does, shatter us in a sense away from our sense of being and our sense of interconnection. But, the thing I want to just say, because I think a really hopeful message too, is that as we stay with our experience and we bring our awareness to our experience, even if it's extremely painful or we're really deep grief or, we're shattered from an assault or from a medical problem or, that there is something that we can find underneath it if we are able to stay with the experience with enough support, I think, from a therapist or our friends or our partner, and with enough support from the way we access our own resiliency or we build our own resiliency so that we can go into that difficult territory. And, I think another important point before I forget it is when you're reading all these self-help books or you're reading books about spirituality, or you're reading books about trauma or whatever, there's so much great information out there. You need to kind of understand what level of human experience they're directing it towards. And normally people talk about 3 different levels, and I think conceptualize it as 4.
Okay.
A lot of people think, okay, there's the every ordinary walking around life, or kind of happily or not so happily in our ego structure, and we're doing our, we're identified, like you said, with what all these different things. And then there's this essential level where we sort of shift out of that into more authenticity, a deeper capacity for intimacy, a sense of realness. Like if you think about your relationships, there's certain people that you feel like they're very authentic. You feel like you can be real. They see you in your realness, and all these different aspects of the essential level. And then beyond that, there's all sorts of boundless, vast interconnection, deeper spiritual experiences that people can tap into as they mature and as they kind of metabolize what their human life has been, whether that's been relatively harmonious life or whether that's been full of trauma or full of disappointment or difficulty or loss. But I think there's really a 4th one, since we're talking about trauma and spirituality. I really feel the trauma category should be its own level because it has its own challenges, its own more severe things to get through. And so I think of it as 4: trauma, regular ego structure work, regular personality stuff that we are managing, and then spiritual experience of essential states, and then moving into like these more vast experiences that are really even beyond the experience of being a human. It doesn't matter if you're human or not human. It's kind of like beyond that. With trauma, so often people get caught in this idea that, oh, well, I'm damaged, I'm never going to be okay. And I think trauma is an interesting challenge on our human journey. First of all, not to mitigate how painful and devastating and shattering it can be. And unresolved trauma is just like living in hell. It just is. But the interesting thing is when we are actually able to tap into it in a way and align with that level of suffering in a way that's manageable, that's what's really important, not overwhelmed. So much can come out of it. There's sort of a hidden gift in trauma that I thought might be interesting for us to explore a little bit in our conversation today. Those people that are familiar with Gurdjieff, he was a spiritual teacher during World War II, I believe. And he said the best time to do spiritual work is when the world is in great turmoil, which certainly was during World War II and certainly I think is now. And I thought, why would he say that? Why would that be true? And I don't know what his answer to that is, but my sort of thought about perspective on that is that trauma generates so much energy. And in the beginning, it can be pain, shock, dissociation, which has a lot of energy in it once you tap into it. And if we learn how to tap into that energy, it's the same energy that fuels the transformation process. But it's like we have to know how to pace it and dose it. You can't just dive head first into really severe trauma because you'll get swallowed up. Usually it's just so overwhelming. It brings you down. But learning how to sort out what's necessary suffering, unnecessary suffering, how to align with that energy in a way that actually fuels transformation. And I think that's something you've spent your life looking at, and I've spent my life looking at, and have all these different doorways into how that might happen more easily for people. So it doesn't have to be so devastating. People feel like it's going to last forever. And that's just actually, it feels like that. That is one of the trauma symptoms. It feels like it's going to be forever, but it isn't actually, So I just wanted to put that perspective in there because it is a challenge that I think all humans face is how do we manage when trauma hits us? How do we make it through it in a way that we actually grow and mature and have post-traumatic growth as a result?
Yeah. It also depends on the kinds of trauma. And you and I have both worked with shock trauma. We wrote a book together on shock trauma many years ago. And of course, then we both work on developmental trauma as well. So there's these two kinds of trauma, but when it happens to a child, so for example, when a child is in a terrible situation for a variety of life reasons, sometimes fate, sometimes very toxic families, it can be a whole range of dynamics, and they use, for example, dissociation, they disconnect from the body and from other people. The Porges's work, kind of a dorsal vagal response, is that when they've never had the experience of any kind of attachment on this level of existence,
right,
it's much different than working with somebody who's had a severe shock trauma later in life.
And they have a good foundation to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and of course, it depends on the person. That's why, one of the things I think we both saw when we were doing shock trauma work is that you can't ignore the individual in there, because dissociation for somebody who's had the experience of being embodied when they were younger is different than working with somebody who's never really had the opportunity to embody, who's always been in some kind of state of disconnection or dissociation. And that's very different work. Again, there's not as clear a foundation to go back to if you've never fully had the opportunity to embody when there's really early or severe kinds of trauma.
Now you're sort of starting from scratch and looking for any signal of a little sprout of connection or a little sprout of healthy attachment, and then emphasizing that and kind of building it and growing it. And, that's a very different, and usually for most people, a little bit slower pace because there's so much healing that has to happen interpersonally. And certainly in the therapist-client relationship, in a way, you're embodying the empathetic other, you're reflecting emotional states the way a good mom or good dad would do. And you're taking on some of the same interrelational skills that actually help the person come back and find themselves from the very beginning. And it's really beautiful work.
It can be such beautiful work. Somebody who's spent their life symptomatic, disconnected, not knowing how to, not being able to feel their emotions or feel their body or be closely connected to other people, and then to watch that transform is such a heart kind of centered process that touches everybody who's involved with it. And whether we're in groups or working one-to-one, it has this kind of dynamic. And in NARM, I would talk about that the spontaneous movement in all of us is towards connection, healing, health. Like no matter how much trauma, that spontaneous movement, as long as a person's still alive and still on this planet,
right,
that spontaneous movement is there. Obviously, when there have been so many significant adaptations to early trauma, the movement to be able to find where and how that movement is coming to the surface is more challenging. But it's, in my experience with, having done this for a long, long time, as have you, is that it's always there. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in our offices. The individual wouldn't be seeking help.
Just the fact that they're showing up in our office is a bid for connection.
Exactly. It's a bid for connection. And, it's like one of the things that in NARM we talk about is the contracting piece, the first pillar, which is really helping people get clear about that. Like, well, we ask them basically what it is that they're wanting for themselves. When they're able to formulate some kind of an intention, that in itself starts the process of connection, even if it's, I'm sure you see this the same, is that longing for deeper connection is coming from a place of connection.
Right.
And then so we find the subtle little seeds of connection that are there, as you described a moment ago. And then we work with that, and in NARM specifically focusing on the learned obstacles that they have developed that now once saved their lives, but now get in the way of the very kinds of connection that they're seeking.
I think it's really an important point that you're making, that when we're even learning attachment theory or learning the character structures or learning any of the wonderful material that's out there that also we provide, to realize that it's really initially wired into survival. This is not like any kind of cognitive decision. It's implicitly wired into our physiology, our nervous system, our brain. We project I love it that I think it's Badenoch that talks about obligatory projection. And I really like that because you can't not project, until the identifications are dissolved, right? So we're going to project our history onto our partners, the world, how we relate to ourselves. So it's kind of a amazing thing to just be able to have a structure, which I like, which NARM provides and DARE provides, of really being able to kind of look at the somewhat predictable issues that go along with certain developmental wounds and certain attachment injuries. And then it's a little bit easier when you have that knowledge, not that you go in with that assumption, but you can detect and see when something's moving towards connection or when something's moving towards a reaction to the obstacle.
That's a really nice way to put it, and it certainly resonates with how I see it, because those elements are always there. And sometimes with some more traumatized clients, they're more difficult to find. I'm curious, in terms of the DARE work, do you address the theme of identity, or how do you, in a direct way or an indirect way, it goes without saying, but
we do address it with even like it's beyond we do more than just attachment styles, but if you just even look at attachment styles, people create an identity around that's somewhat, that'll have elements of those pieces in it. And disidentification is part of how the wound heals, right? That you start to see other opportunities, other ways connection can happen, different ways that healing can happen. And identity, of course, is a really big fundamental issue in the human journey, for sure, from a spiritual perspective too, that you're really looking at how to dissolve defensive identity that's not really helpful, like you said, was helpful initially, but isn't helpful later. And really aligning more with what's a fundamental truth, what's truer, deeper truth about ourselves and who we are as beings and who we are as human beings, besides our identity that gets structured in from how we react or how we were reacted to or treated when we were younger, or, how life shaped us. It could not necessarily from the family. It could be you grew up in a war zone. There's different things that influence how we create that identity.
Yeah. And I'm certain, knowing you, but you can clarify it for me, but that you're probably on the same page with this. But one of my very earliest experiences, even before I started doing my spiritual work, it's part of what led me to spiritual work. And I don't remember, you may have heard this story before or not, I don't remember. But, I was doing a certain kind of fourth chakra breath work with this guy who had been recommended to me. And at that point, I would have called myself, I don't know, agnostic or atheist. It's like I certainly wasn't a believer in kind of the little bit of traditional religion that I had been exposed to, which wasn't all that much, and maybe in some ways, fortunately. But this experience in doing this fourth chakra breath work that I did was that I opened up in a way that I'd never experienced before. I experienced the universe in a different way, and I experienced myself as this point of light in this large web of billions, infinite number of other points of light. And I could experience the energetic connection between all of these points of light. And even beyond that, I experienced that really every molecule of me and every molecule of the universe was made with love. And I know it's a little goofy to talk about that sometimes, because
actually that's true.
But it is that truth, that experience is what led me to, I think, the spiritual context where we originally met, and has been with me. It changed my life at that one session. And the interesting thing is that the person who did that work with me, I know he's still around someplace, but I didn't realize for maybe months or years the full impact of it. And I've never had the opportunity to tell him how significant just that one life experience was for me. And then, of course, there were many others that came later.
He'd probably love hearing that from you. And I imagine he had his own capacity to embody that state for you to also be invited into it. It speaks to his development. I think I just want to say that because the more we work as therapists or as human beings, whatever role we're in the world, the more we're able to hold. Now that goes both directions. The more we're able to open to deep pain and trauma, we're able to hold deeper, more difficult developmental or shock trauma situations. But also the more we deepen and mature in our own souls, we're able to invite and transmit and hold these other kinds of boundless state. Really, what in my experience, what you're describing as a boundless state, that is the experience of everything is love. I've had that experience, not the beginning. You started your beginning search in it with a bang, but that's a very big opening. But having that opening, of course, would bring up your curiosity to understand.
Yeah.
You see, glimpse of the truth behind our normal everyday experience. And the more we get those glimpses, I feel so privileged every time I get a little glimpse or a little taste of it, because it just changes then how you see everything that's happening interpersonally and, work with trauma or wounds or how to help people move through these things. That having that background of seeing that everything is made of love, it changes your whole orientation. You know that to be true. Maybe not every minute walking around, but
not every minute of every day, but yes.
But I have had that experience. So I have it as a touchstone. Like part of me knows it. Sometimes it becomes a cognitive knowing when it was originally an experiential, which feels more real.
Right.
But you still have that orientation. And I feel like sometimes I have the conviction for my clients or my students before they do. I have the conviction that they're going to be okay, that things are going to work out. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I know it's going to happen. And that knowing, I think sometimes that confidence or that knowing I have inside me, somehow, even if I don't generally say anything about it, but it's underlying invitation for that person to move into a more healed circumstance. We're kind of talking beyond techniques right now. I mean, we could go into all that, but I really find it so fascinating to talk with you about just this orientation and why spiritual orientation. I mean, I don't even know how I would do the work I do without spiritual orientation. I mean, it's so much a part of me. I don't know. I can't strip that out and separate it anymore. And like that experience you described, I had a kind of an interesting experience, a little bit similar, but just to give people an idea. I was feeling this, I guess they call it bhakti. I was feeling this devotion. I was feeling this incredible gratitude, this devotion. I kept feeling this devotion to just how life is and, source, whatever you want to call it. And I kept feeling this devotion. And the person that was facilitating my spiritual session with me, they kept saying, just keep going, keep going. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm here already. This is amazing. I'm feeling incredible open heart devotion. And it just kept getting stronger. I was keep going. And like, I wasn't doing anything. And I was like, well, this is amazing, but they kept saying, I'm getting a little annoyed at this point. I'm like, I'm fine, leave me alone, And all of a sudden I was feeling this devotion, like outwardly, like, I don't know, the universe or God or whatever you would call it. And all of a sudden it flipped and I felt the universe loving me, like everything, just this gigantic love, just flooding my experience. And it was personal and universal at the same time. I mean, I felt it personally, but I knew it was true, obviously, for everyone. It wasn't just me, I wasn't like this special little human other than my natural specialness, right? Like we all have our specialness, but it's just this flood of love. And I mean, there's all sorts of spiritual experiences. Sometimes certain ones really affect you. And I think in terms of related to work, I always tell my students that they shouldn't really work with someone that they don't have the capacity to love. And I know we don't throw that word around a lot in therapy, but I learned that from Sheldon Kopp. He wrote a book in the 70s called Back to One. And he talked about that. He said, if you don't have the capacity to love your client, you should refer them to somebody who can, And I think early stuff like the attachment and your developmental trauma work as well as shock trauma, but that's really important.
It's so important because the way I would translate that into my own language and understanding is that if you can't really be there with your client with an open heart, to kind of change the wording to that, you're not going to be effective. So whether that means loving your client or just being in a loving space where there's acceptance and compassion that are there, not something you're trying to do, but it's just part of what you're bringing, it changes the whole dynamic of the relationship and the therapeutic process. And I really liked what you said, and I very much resonate with what you said about, and so much has to do with the capacity of the therapist, that relational and deep capacity for connection and open, at least in NARM. And I think you're drawn more to the heart-oriented traditions as I am, but that to be there with this open heart that's open to both joy and suffering and can make room for all of that creates a space implicitly where the client feels safer and safer to show up in themselves and in relationship with you. That's why particularly I think, Diane, with the earliest traumas, what I talk about in NARM as the connection survival style used to be more pathological language, which I don't use anymore. But the earliest stage of trauma is that this capacity to be with the client and not to do to the client is so fundamental, because I see, depending on which side of the spectrum the therapist is coming from, like the more self-regulation oriented therapists, they'll meet somebody who's profoundly dissociated, very early trauma, all kinds of ongoing life difficulties, and they'll start to try and regulate their nervous system, which is non-relational. It's like they're just seeing them as a nervous system, and we got to get this person regulated. And some therapists will say, and we got to get them, they'll see that they're not in their bodies, the client's not in their bodies, and they'll want to try and get them into their bodies. And that, of course, I believe you probably agree with me, you'll tell me, but that obviously doesn't work, is that people are out of their bodies. They're out of connection for a reason. And we've got to, in whatever, both through what we bring and what we hold, as well as the understanding that we hold, make it a safe space for clients, particularly with these earliest wounds, to begin to show up. And you referred kind of tangentially to what introjected empathic object process. That's so needed. And I think the mistake that I've seen in some of the different spiritual work that I've done is this kind of reinforcing this idea that you can do this all yourself.
Yeah, okay, we could get on a soapbox about that one.
Yeah, we could.
I really have a thing about that. And I think in a way, I mean, you can do some things on your own, right? Of course. But I don't know. What I'm loving about this conversation is this orientation that connection is foundational. And how do we repair that? And how do we show up for that? And how do we engage with that? And how do we deepen that? And I remember listening at a conference, Dan Siegel was talking, and he said, we've done all this work in the human, we've learned about dream study, we've learned about emotions, we've learned about cognition, we have these therapies around all that, the body, all this stuff, even awareness of awareness. But he said the real frontier for human beings is connection. Is what we need to understand and maybe don't understand so well sometimes. That's really the real frontier for the human journey. And I was like, yes, I really found that, like, with all this trauma work and all the ways I've gone off in different directions in my career, I just felt like the culmination of it was to, like, bring all that. I mean, understanding is helpful, but the connection is so much what's needed. And we're designed for connection, and we're also get hurt in relationships. We also heal in relationships. I feel really so important. And I agree with so much spiritual work is very individually focused. And I think that can be hurtful to people's relationships. It can be hurtful to the person, but it can also be damaging to their intimate relationships. And that's kind of a that way, I mean, there's a way to not have it include this.
Yeah, I don't think either of us would disagree that ultimately we're all supported by, and we can use different words, but a certain kind of being. But that doesn't mean that when you don't have access to that level of experience, you need somebody else who can hold a space for you and understand that and do the work that's needed to help you to show up and to reconnect on the deepest level to being or non-duality in your, those kinds of deeper states that we all have potential access to, but without trying to push, like sometimes you absolutely need support from the outside before you can find that inner connection and that inner support. So it has been a little bit of a soapbox for me about some kinds of spiritual work that I've done and that I've seen other people do, that it pushes this kind of idea that I don't disagree with it. It always comes ultimately back to being, but there are often many, many steps in the way, and people have to find that themselves, because we can talk about spiritual stuff and it can sound new agey or sound all kinds of things, and we both know that we're not in that place. But it's easy to confuse some of the new age philosophy with the kinds of depth that is possible when there's a kind of a somewhat degree of awareness of a spiritual underpinning to this whole dynamic.
Well, there's another thing that's floating around, like this idea that you can't love someone else until you love yourself. And I'm like, that's kind of backwards, because a lot of times, I mean, there's this idea, well, when you love yourself, you'll be able to love, and I'm like, you need to be in a healing environment where you're experiencing reflection and caring and attunement and alignment. And that leads to a deeper self-love, but to say, okay, I've got to get all that worked out myself before I'm fit to be in a relationship, it just feels...
No, because then you'll never be in a relationship.
Idea. I've heard people say that, I mean, at least 10 or 20 times in different contexts.
I actually have an argument with this whole idea of self-love. Because self-love, the concept implies there's a duality in there. There's a self, or there's something that loves the self. I'm okay talking about self-acceptance, self-caring, self-compassion, because then there's more of a duality. But really, the way I've experienced it, at least, is that there's not a duality there. It more has to do with being yourself on the deepest levels of connection. And love is both implicit and explicit in that context. And I mean, we can talk about hating yourself. We do that all the time because then there is a duality. But I prefer to move away from that in terms of it's more just being yourself, more on the deepest levels of authenticity. And, in NARM, it's very much in terms of the part of the 4 pillars that we've developed is that exploring what's getting in the way of the deeper connection that's possible for all of us. And there's always this question that comes up well, when we clear out all of the things in the way, what's left? And a lot of the things that are in the way are, obviously on the bodily level, the profound dysregulation, systemic dysregulation, on an identity level, the profound distortions of identity. But when we clear all of that away, everybody wants to know, okay, well, I don't know about everybody, but a lot of people have asked me, so what's left? And I always take some kind of evasive action with that question in some way and say, well, let's just wait and see, or that's a good question, or some guru like thing. I don't want to be anybody's guru, but because this deeper level of connection is not a static process. I can say more of what it isn't. It's not static. I mean, there are lots of words that we have, like the Hungarian psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi talked about flow. Of course, in different spiritual traditions, there's different languaging for essential states or deep energies or various kinds of things, but it's not something that you can capture and put in a box. Identity is that box, which doesn't allow for that kind of flow. And the kind of deep flow or deep that comes with connection is not so easily described. You have to experience it. You can't take somebody else's word for it.
No. Yeah, I think that's why even in the healing work, the experiential focus is so important, just to see what's arising. And it's not really a protocol-based orientation,
Exactly. And in these times of manualized therapies, and just from my point of view, and I'm assuming you probably agree, is ignore the depth of who we are, that we're much more than just symptoms, and symptoms are much more than just something to get rid of. Of course, we don't want to be symptomatic and the suffering that goes with that. But we want to listen to those symptoms because there are all of these symptoms that we experience, whatever level of experience that is. They're telling us, they're pointing the way to where we're experiencing some kind of disconnection with what is most real and alive and connected in ourselves.
Yes, that symptoms actually, we're sort of unpacking them, like seeing what's stimulating them, what's encased in them, what they're representing, what the message of the symptom is,
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully eventually it dissolves if it's the right time for it to dissolve, but it is a different orientation than just kind of trying to cut it out,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And really, that's, from my point of view anyway, that's in certain areas, that's where we've devolved to. And obviously given the limitations of understanding and resources.
We've just mechanicalized it. People want just fast, like fast food. They want fast therapy. They want a quick technique. It's a different mindset. And I don't know why I call it third wave therapy, but third wave therapy, in my definition of it, is you're responding to something moment to moment as it's arising. So you're organic, you're engaged, you're present. Your inner wisdom is responding to what's arising in the session, and not like, okay, now it's time for this protocol or this, intervention. I mean, we teach different supportive interventions, but it has a lot to do with being present. But that's the most important thing of knowing how to show up as a therapist, and also encouraging and making a space where your clients can join you. In my own way of understanding different therapeutic models, and I think a lot of them have value in the way they're structured and they have something to offer. But when I think of third wave models, I really think about therapy models that are meeting the experience of what's happening in the moment as it arises, and not thinking about like, okay, now this intervention, that intervention, this protocol, that sort of thing. I feel like that requires a certain depth in the therapist to be able to do that. But I feel like that's where I'm called, and that's where I feel that richest transformation can happen. And it doesn't mean that other models aren't valuable in certain situations and they offer certain things. But yeah, I just feel the moment to moment or sort of organic process of what's unfolding is really helpful. And that doesn't mean that you just follow somebody down the rabbit hole either.
Exactly.
There's a guidance that's happening. You're not just going,
exactly.
Because sometimes people can get caught in a story about their situation, which could go on forever and nothing really shifts, right? So it's like learning how to do that really supports the transformational process.
I couldn't help but just think, Diane, about another spiritual experience that I had. And it's actually, you were there, and it was actually just the two of us. It was shortly after the unexpected death of my older brother.
I remember.
Yeah. And, of course, I was in so much pain. And you just were there. I don't remember you actually doing anything, but just the space that opened up where out of all of that incredible pain that I was feeling about his passing is that my heart opened up in a way, in a deeper way than even that original experience that I talked about. And it was, again, just one of the many different kinds of things, but a very important element of that work. I imagine you might remember, it seems like you remember it too, but it certainly had a big impact on me. So.
Yeah. Sometimes the depth of our grief can also open us into this deeper understanding, but there has to be a space to do that in and a willingness to allow it. So,
well, and it was also had something to do with your capacity to be in that space with me, not try to do anything, not try to make me feel better, but just that you had the capacity to hold that space with me. And that helped me to kind of move in and through the grief, but then to this deeper opening that was, again, one of the most profound experiences of my life, seriously. So, in all of these years, I don't think we ever have talked about that time. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share my appreciation for your ability to be there with me in that difficult time.
Oh, privileged to be there and glad we could share that. Yeah.
Yeah. So what have you got on your agenda for this coming year, both personally and professionally? Anything that you want to share?
Yeah. We have an ongoing program every month. It's called Therapy Mastermind Circle that we invite different, sometimes I teach the classes and often I'm co-teaching with somebody that's been in the trenches about a certain topic for a long time. And right now we're working with Lisa Wimberger on neurosculpting, and she has some really lovely neuroscience foundational things that really help with vagal toning, help people come out of if they have a tendency to be a little shut down or a little. It's in the moment, but it's also practices that people can do that are actually helpful to bring either calm the overactivated sympathetic or, support coming back into deeper connection to oneself. And that's really what the foundation of it is. And then we're doing a course with Peter Levine coming up in January again. And we always like working together, and he will show some of his demos that people really enjoy seeing those. And he's kind of a master at shifting people out of certain deep trauma states. So that will be helpful. And then we're going to be working with David Wallen on early attachment. And he was another master of really being in the relational field and reading the relational field and encouraging people to come out of difficult attachment injuries or developmental trauma. He's really focuses a lot on developmental trauma. And he's a good teacher. He's fun to hang out with. He'll be working with us for about 6 months, once a month. And yeah, so we're doing our normal attachment trainings coming up. We're just doing one soon on that one of my teachers is teaching. And then I'm teaching again in next year on the early attachment issues and how to recognize and understand yourself compassionately. What I like about really understanding attachment, and certainly true with developmental trauma too, is when you really understand some of what your partner might be carrying or what might be getting enacted in your relationship, you can meet it with a lot more compassion instead of blaming yourself or blaming them because they're insensitive or whatever. It kind of takes that shame blame out of it. So that's an overarching goal for our work as well. And just trying to make things really accessible for people, whether it's therapists or sometimes we really have programs for the public so that they just have some hopefully helpful insight to promote healing. And we're just looking at all different ways to do that. We have a new website coming out. That's been quite a big push this year. And so we're excited. It's coming out probably, I say this like it should be about a month. It'll be back out. We have a free attachment quiz on there people can take whenever they want, just to sort of get a little bit. It's a point of exploration. It's not a research-based, kind of thing, but it'll We'll sort of get a sense. It might raise some questions like, oh, I didn't, okay, yeah, I do that. I wonder what that's about. It just is sort of a trigger for a little self-exploration. I appreciate the book you just sent me that just came out. So that's exciting.
Yeah, and Brad and I are very glad that it's been doing really well and been really well accepted so far. So, and we both feel like it's an important contribution to our common field. And I've got also some other projects. One that I'm excited about, which is going to be on one of the major streaming platforms that I can't say just yet because it's still not in that business when things are not signed at all. You never know for sure, but there's a lot of interesting kinds of dynamics going on. And just, when we first started teaching, we were teaching, like, as you mentioned, shock trauma together. I was already teaching the NARM work, but I didn't have the NARM name at the time. That was the character structure work, as you recall. And to see since then how much understanding has kind of filtered out into the culture. I remember when you and I would go into a group of professionals, including, all kinds of professionals, mental health professionals, medical doctors, and people really, it sounds amazing these days that we had to explain what the fight-flight response was. It's like it was not common knowledge there.
No, it wasn't. And people didn't have any idea that the body and the mind were connected. It was this idea, really revolutionary idea that the body had anything to do with anything, so.
Yeah, and there were even some systems that said, well, if it's in the body, then it's a conversion reaction, and some kind of acting out. It's hard for many people who are newer to the field to realize how much has changed in the last 30, 40 years in terms of the general understanding. And even clients coming in, sometimes to their detriment because they've read a lot about trauma and there's all these different ideas about trauma. But overall, I think it's been a positive shift in that there's much more awareness of just how widespread what we're calling trauma is. And my own little thing too is I think sometimes people are overusing the word trauma, but that's another issue, talking about a single event that's really not a shock trauma, calling it traumatizing, for example. But that tends to happen in our culture. But I am really happy about the overall movement that we've seen in both understanding shock trauma and developmental trauma. And hopefully, it'll be soon that there's a CPTSD diagnosis, not just in the World Health Organization that we have now, but in the DSM, and that'll make a big difference for all of us. So
the other movement that I think is so good in our field is that it used to be so pathologizing, and now that's shifted quite a bit. And that just used to be, adding insult to injury, dealing with a trauma, and then on top of it, you're pathologized, and I'm really happy to see that I feel like we're moving away from that a lot.
We are, and certainly that was my orientation in NARM, was to move away from that. And I always talk about it's important to embrace the wisdom of all of these so-called defense mechanisms that really help us move beyond that. So like when I talk about dissociation, I talk about it's that capacity that we as human beings have that helps us bear the unbearable.
Right.
And that shifts the understanding for a lot of people away from a pathology. Obviously, when it continues late into life or into adulthood, it does create a problem. I still won't use the word pathology. But to understand its basic survival mechanism, along with many others of the so-called traditional defense mechanisms, that's been an important part of at least what I've tried to contribute in terms of that non-pathologizing orientation.
Yeah, that's really beautiful.
Yeah. Well, it's really great to see you, and take care of yourself. Have a good year, and we'll talk together again hopefully soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? We are excited to be kicking off trainings in early 2023 designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.